And thank you for the invitation, and I am also happy to be here and to contribute to this conference. I'm working at the Water Management Unit at the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management. And I will present a project leading to a national guideline for setting objectives in Nature 2000 areas. The national guideline was developed in cooperation with representatives for the water district authorities and the county administrative boards. Those authorities are the users of the guideline. The work was partly financed by 2 EU LIFE projects, and that enabled us to arrange workshops and field visits. The work was also, the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency was also involved in the project, since that agency is responsible for the terrestrial part of the Nature 2000. The content of this presentation is the aim of the project and the national guideline. I'll give some results, latest results of the classification of ecological status and the assessment of significant pressures in Swedish rivers. I'll give the latest results of the conservation status in Swedish rivers, and some short information about the National Plan for Sustainable Hydropower. I might repeat some of the information you heard from Johan this morning, but this is in a new context. I'll always give the principles when setting objectives for the river basin management plans, and I'll give you a short overview of the workflow, and at last I will give you an example of setting the objectives. And the aim of the project and the guideline is to implement European Union law into Swedish environmental law. Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management is a governmental agency, and we produce regulations and guidelines. The aim is also to integrate the objectives of good ecological status, the concept in the Water Framework Directive, with the concept of favorable conservation status in the Habitat Directive. We also want to facilitate coordinated measures to reach the objectives in the river basin management plans. Further on, we will facilitate the process of revising the environmental permits for hydropower plants. And this was the project is a deliverable in the action in these EU LIFE projects I mentioned before. Here is a graph over the status in Swedish river water bodies. As you can see, the ecological status in the bar to the left, approximately 60% of the river water bodies are in less than good status. And from the bars, the other bars, you can see the classifications of the parameters: lateral connectivity, hydrological regime, morphological condition, and nutrients. From these bars, you can see that it is the lateral connectivity that is most often causing the less than good status. And here is a graph over the significant pressures in Swedish river water bodies. And you can see from the results of the assessments illustrated by the orange bar that it's dams, barriers, locks connected to hydropower. That is the second most dominating pressure type in Swedish rivers. And here are the latest results. According to the Habitat Directive, the conservation status for biogeographical regions should be assessed and reported every 6th year. So here are the latest results from Swedish reporting, and you can see that for Swedish rivers, the most common habitat types in Swedish rivers, the trend is the status is unfavorable and the trend is deteriorating. And dominating pressures here as well is hydropower plants, former log driving routes, water extractions, road crosses, and climate change. And as measure to reduce the pressures on Swedish river water bodies, a national plan for sustainable hydropower was decided by the Swedish Parliament. And the plan is to revise permits according to the Water Framework Directive and the Habitats Directive, and involves approximately 2,000 hydropower plants in approximately 450 Natura 2000 areas. And as mentioned before, the hydropower plants are revised in groups at catchment levels, approximately 200 groups. And the time period for this revising process is between this year and until 2040. And the limitation is the availability of the approval process of the Swedish environmental court system. In protected areas, member states shall achieve compliance with any standards and objectives specified in the community legislation under which the individual protected area has been established. And where more than one of the objectives relates to a given body of water, the most stringent shall apply. That's the basis for the implementation. And member states are supposed to have a register over the protected areas. And here is a map over the river Emån, mouthing in the South Baltic Sea. And in fact, it's the same river that Irene showed recently on her picture about water drought. And the areas, the rivers and lakes marked in green here are Natura 2000 areas and are as such protected for the surface water and groundwater, directly depending the conservation where habitats and species are directly depending on the surface water or the groundwater. The conservation status of a natural habitat will be taken as favorable when its natural range and areas it covers within that range are stable or increasing, and the specific structure and functions which are necessary for its long-term maintenance exist and are likely to continue to exist for the foreseeable future, and the conservation status of its typical species is favorable. And the objectives in the water bodies that wholly or partly constitutes the N2000 area should ensure a contribution to the favorable conservation status in the biogeographical area. And the conservation status of a species will be taken favorable when population dynamics data on the species concerned indicated that it's maintaining itself on a long-term basis as a viable component of its natural habitats, and the natural range of the species is neither being reduced nor is likely to be reduced for the foreseeable future. And there is and will probably continue to be a sufficiently large habitat to maintain its population on a long-term basis. And also, member states should establish conservation plans and site-specific objectives and taking necessary conservation measures, having appropriate management plans specifically designed for the sites, and measures that ensure measures which correspond to the ecological requirements of the natural habitat types and species present in the sites. And according to European Union guidance, conservation measures should be integrated in river basin management plans. And here you're familiar with the quality elements and the parameters of ecological status. And those quality elements corresponds to some ecological requirements of structures and functions which are necessary for favorable conservation status. And as you know, the physicochemical quality elements of nutrients, oxygen balance, transparency, pH acidification, and so forth. And we also have got these hydromorphological quality elements, connectivity, hydrological regime, and morphological conditions, which are structuring the ecosystems and also are structuring the habitats for making life room for the species. And of course, we have biological quality elements indicating a presence of species and species composition in rivers and lakes. And in Sweden, we have a quality element fish in rivers called the VIX index, which is a multimetric index. And it constitutes of the summary of number of salmon and trout, and proportion of tolerant species, and proportion of tolerant individuals, proportion of intolerant species, proportion of salmonids that reproduce, and Simpson Diversity Index. And here is a workflow with the principal steps when setting the legally binding VFD objectives in correspondence with the site-specific objectives for the protected habitats and species. It's complicated, of course, and you are not able to read all of it, but the principle is that you have the blue line where this more traditional VFD work process with analysis of pressure and impact, classification, and so forth. And then on the green side, you have the information coming from conservation plan, from the N2000 sites. And then the first step is the important, maybe the most important step, is to assess the ecological requirements for the conservation of habitat and species. And if these ecological requirements are asking for more stringent VFD objectives. And then you continue the ordinary VFD process, integrating the information from the Habitat Directive. And in step 7, you end up in setting a legal binding objective, adjusted for the more stringent objective. And here is, so how to assess the ecological requirement. Here is an example to how to assess the ecological requirements for the freshwater pearl mussel. And for a population on long-term basis, the following is needed: a reproducing population of salmonids, clear, oxygenated, and nutrient-poor water, stable pH values above 6.2, sufficiently large habitats of hard bottoms with gravel, stones, and boulders, and limited sedimentation of fine minerogenic or organic material. And these ecological requirements of the freshwater pearl mussel leads to a more stringent objective that we can see is disposed by or linked to this multimetric VIX index for fish in rivers, to the quality element of nutrient in rivers, to the quality element of morphological condition, and to the quality element of hydrological regime. So at step 1 in the workflow, we have assessed the ecological requirements, and we could conclude that this need This leads to a more stringent objective than the quality element for good ecological status, since the ecological requirements of having a reproducing population of salmonids in numbers of young salmonids more than 5 per 100 square meter is not possible, is not an indicator for good ecological status at this stage. So the ecological requirement can be disposed by the quality element fish in rivers and the density and the parameter density and age structure for salmonids. And this is one of the more stringent objectives raised by the freshwater pearl mussel, that in the river water bodies, that wholly or partly constitutes the Natura 2000 site, the number of young salmonids should be present in numbers above 5 per 100 square meter. And then we ends up in the step 7 in the workflow, setting the more stringent objective for the water bodies that wholly or partly constitutes a Natura 2000 site. We see that there are a more stringent objective needed by the freshwater pearl mussel. And the environmental quality standard could be formulated like good ecological status for 2027 with the adjustment of the quality element fish in rivers as the following: that young salmonids shall be present in numbers of more than 5 per 100 square meters, and good status for remaining quality elements. And there is possibilities to apply exemptions, as you know, according to Article 4 in Water Framework Directive. But an exemption must not permanently exclude or compromise the achievement of the objectives of Water Framework Directive in other bodies of water within the same river basin district. And it should be consistent with the implementation of the objectives in the Nature 2000 areas. It's also possible to apply exemptions from the objectives in Habitat Directive. It's stated in Article 6.4 that a plan or a project must nevertheless be carried out for imperative reasons of overriding public interest, including those of social or economic nature. And the member state shall take compensatory measures necessary to ensure that the overall coherence of the Nature 2000 is protected. In Sweden, this is a decision for the government, and it is not possible for the water district authorities to apply this exemption. This is the case at the moment in Sweden, and we are foreseeing that it might be needed some exemptions due to the goal of renewable energy and the parliamentary agreement of no significant harm on the electricity production. So we'll see what happens.